Thank you very much, and I'd like to start firstly by acknowledging the Noongar people of our nation. Thank you, and I pay my respects to their elders, both past and present. And to me that's particularly important because I spent my entire life in this state working with Aboriginal people, and I want to talk about it a little bit when I start to talk about some of the stories as a policeman. There's two things that I often think about when it comes to policing. There's two sayings, actually, two quotes. And the first one is by a fellow who was a commentator in England, Gilbert. I can't think of his second name at the moment, but he said, "I like to see policemen about the place, preferably big ones that have worn their hats long enough not to be embarrassed by them." The other one is a saying by Brendan Behan, the Irish playwright, who said, "There is no situation so dismal that a policeman can't make it worse." And so both of those really apply to me. And I'm going to talk about hats a little bit, and part of my talk tonight I'll talk about hats. A little bit about my history, though. I was born in South Wales, born in Cardiff, and I grew up during the war. I was born in 1944, towards the end of the war. My father was a member of the Czech Air Force. He met my mother in Pembroke Dock. She was a WAF, and I was the result. And after the war, my father went back to the Czech Republic. So for about the first 5 years of my life, I lived with my grandmother and my mother in Cardiff until my father came back when the communists took over the Czech Republic, and he couldn't get on with the communists, much the same as he couldn't get on with the Nazis. So he came back. But I grew up, the first 5 years I spent living with my grandmother's house, which was a little different because my grandmother was a Fire and Eternal Baptist, Damnation Baptist. My mother was Church of England and my father was Catholic, so I used to go to school 3 times a day on a Sunday. I was thoroughly confused by the time I got to 16, I've got to tell you. But it was an interesting place to grow up as a Welshman. I still sing, and my father being Czech, I drink beer, so it fits me perfectly, I might say. My first encounter with the police was actually in Wales when I was about 8 or 9 years of age. I used to walk to school every day down to the primary school. It's called Viriamia Jones, and I used to walk. And in Wales in those days, or in England, if anybody here come from England, they'll remember the bobbies. You had a local policeman that everybody knew, and our local policeman was a fellow called Granville Thomas, and he was a very big policeman. Well, I think he was, because I was only little in those days. But I can remember coming home from school, and we used to have to cross Western Avenue. Anybody that knows Cardiff knows that it was the biggest exporter of coal back in those days. And one of the main mines, Torres mine, which was just up the road, the coal trucks used to come down Western Avenue that we had to cross when we were coming home from school. And Granville Thomas used to get there of an afternoon, and he would stop the coal trucks coming down the road, and then we'd come across the footpath, or across the walkway, the Belisha beacons as they called them in those days. So this particular day I was in a hurry. I didn't want to stop. So I raced across the crosswalk while Granville was talking to some women on the side, and his bike was parked there. I nearly got hit by a coal truck. And when I got off the road, Granville grabbed me and he gave me the biggest boot up the backside I ever had, and he said, in his Welsh accent, he said, "You stand by my bike, boyo," he said. "Don't you bloody do a thing." He said, "You stand there." And I stood there. And all my mates are going past on the way home, and I've never been so humiliated. But it got worse, because when he'd finished the crosswalk, he put me on the bar of his bike and he took me home. I can still remember to this day, we lived in a place called Maylog Place. It was a cul-de-sac. And I can still remember going down the cul-de-sac, and anybody that lives in the Welsh village or the Welsh towns will know all the houses come right out onto the street. There's no front gardens. And I can still remember to this day looking up as we were on the bike, and all the curtains were moving as we were going down the road. And I got to the house, and Granville took me up by the scruff of the neck, and he banged on the door, and my grandmother and my mother came to the house, and he told them I hadn't actually done anything wrong really, but he told me, he said this and this. Anyway, when the door shut, I got the biggest hiding I've ever had in my life off my mother, because I brought the policeman to the house. Then my grandmother gave me a hiding because that upset my mother, and it was her house, and how dare me bring shame on the house. And then I got those magic words, "You wait till your father gets home." And I did. And then my grandfather came home, My father came home, I got another hiding off, and my grandfather came home, I got another one off him because I'd brought the copper to the house, you see. Because the one thing that was about in those days was shame. It was shameful to bring the policeman to the house. And I never forgot that. And years and years later, when I first started as a young constable here, Perth was very much the same. You still had that sense of shame if you got involved with the police. Unfortunately, that's gone nowadays. Usually the policeman, if they challenge somebody or take anybody home, it's the opposite. It's the poor old policeman who feels shame for upsetting the household, but very different. I was going to come to Australia when I was about 17. I'd finished high school, I'd matriculated, and I'd won a scholarship with ICI to go and study, of all things, economics. Can you imagine me as a treasurer? I tell you, it'd be wonderful. I didn't go. A mate of mine called Verdon Oliver and I decided we'd come over to Australia on a thing. We'd take a couple of years off from university and we'd come to Australia and we'd be immigrants. So we got onto a thing called the Big Brother scheme, which was you paid 10 quid and they brought you out here, and after 2 years, if you didn't like it, you could go home, but you didn't have to pay your fare back, which was the best part. So out we came. Anyway, during the process, of all things, Verdon, my mate, actually got locked up for thieving from the shop where he used to work, so he didn't come. But my parents decided that they would come, and so my father sold his businesses at that time. He was a small goods manufacturer, and he had shops and a little factory. He sold the whole thing up, and the whole family decided to emigrate. And we arrived in Perth in 1964 on a boat called the Fair Sky, which was marvellous. I arrived here and I thought, how long has this been going on? What a wonderful place. I absolutely fell in love with Western Australia. I became passionate about it, and I also fell in love with two other things. The first thing was surfing. I found this magic idea you could get on a surfboard, and I never realised that this existed until and then the second most wonderful thing I met was my wife Susan, and unfortunately she sends her apologies. She was coming tonight, but she's being Nana's taxi, so she couldn't. But I met Susan, and I started surfing, and anyway, for about 2 years I did nothing but little local jobs. I did whatever I could get, and I was deciding whether or not I should go back to university, and then I decided I really was very keen on Susan, so I went and saw her father and I said, you know, I think we should get married. And he said, well, you better go and get a job then. So I thought, what am I going to do? And I could remember Granville Thomas back in those days, and I thought, yeah, if you can't beat him, you might as well join him. So I went along and I did the introduction and I did my exams and everything. In those days, it was very different when you joined the police force. You had to be at least 5'10". You had to have a 44 chest, and that didn't matter whether you're a bloke or a woman. It didn't matter. There were police women in those days, but they were very different to the police women we have nowadays. And you had to be, you couldn't have flat feet, which was a problem because I had flat feet. They didn't test your eyes, they counted them, so to make sure you were there. Then they put you into a school, and for 16 weeks they turned you into Solomon. In 16 weeks, coming back, and it always brings me back to the National Trust, because why I'm so passionate about history, my whole life in Western Australia has revolved basically around the city, but many of the buildings that I now am privileged to help take care of. And the first place was the old girls' school down at East Perth, which we're currently involved with one of the developers. The police school was up in the old domestic science block, and I don't know if any of you ladies actually went to that school. You did. My wife did too. She went there, and when I told her I was going in the police force, and she pointed out that was the domestic science block upstairs on top, and that's where we had the school. For 16 weeks they turned us into Solomon, and the fellow who was in charge of the police school in those days was a fellow called Max White. And the first couple of weeks you were there, they decided to try you out to see whether you should be a policeman, and they tested you and all these different things. Then they gave us a uniform, and this is where my first hat came in. This is not my first hat. My son actually wore my hat out. He wore it around the backyard for that many years. It fell to bits. But they gave us these hats, and this was the first hat that they gave us, the police hats. They were slightly different in those days with a different badge. The badge had the black swan on it and a very different crest. And we couldn't understand why we had to wear these things, because they're a nuisance. Because every time you chase somebody, they come off and you lose them. And then if you lose them, they kick them around the street. And when you go back, there's what's left of them. Anyway, Max White stood us in front. There was a full-sized glass mirror in the police in the classroom, and there were 24 people in my school. 22 of them finished the school. One of them actually got sacked because we went out and did some shooting practice out of what is now Burns Beach in the lime kilns out there, and unfortunately one of the fellows shot a seagull when he was dressing, so he got sacked. But during the school, Max would stand us in front of the mirror, and he'd say to me, "How tall are you, Kucera?" And I'd say, 6 foot, sir. And he said, "Don't call me sir, I'm a sergeant." And he said, "Put the hat on." And I put the hat on, and he said, "How tall are you now?" I'd look at it, and he said, "You're 6'6" now." And he said, "And that's very, very important." And I said, "Why is that?" He said, "Well, because when you have to confront somebody on the street," he said, "they will always look at the highest point on your body." And he said, "Normally it's your eyes." He said, "If they're looking at your eyes, you're at a disadvantage." He said, "If they're looking at the badge on your hat, you've got an advantage, because when you go to grab them, you'll always telegraph it with your eyes." And he was dead right. Now, I don't know if they still teach that in the police school, but he was absolutely right. That was the first hat they gave me. I finished the police school, and on the night that I graduated, Susan and I also got engaged, she's, as I say, she's been with me ever since. My first posting was into the city, and again we talk about buildings. In those days, the central police station was actually what is now the administration block for the academy, for the art gallery in James Street. And there was we used to front up of a morning, and you'd be in uniform. If it was 7 o'clock start, you had to get there by about 6:10, and you fronted up with your uniform, and they gave when we left the school, they gave us a pair of handcuffs, which I still have. Well, actually, they're not my originals. My originals are actually hanging on a wall in Vladivostok, but that's another story. I'll tell you about that later on. They gave you that. They gave you a baton, which was the other thing you got, and it's still got teeth marks in it. And these were marvellous for getting people out of the pub when they were drunk. You didn't have to hit them. You just came behind them and you put a hand under their nose and you put this where the sun doesn't shine, and they would go out on tiptoe. It was you never had any problems with it. But that's what they gave you. They also gave you a notebook. You had to buy your own pen, and they gave you a whistle. And each morning before you went out on the beat in Perth, I should say, in those days, because my first posting was to Perth, they would line you up in the what's now the old art gallery behind the courthouse there, and you would all line up and you would march over the Horseshoe Bridge, and then you would go out onto what's called beats. And you had a set area that you would walk in the city, and each beat was numbered, and each beat had a time that you walked on it, and you walked on your own. You weren't teamed up with anybody. That was it, and that's all you had. You didn't have guns and pepper sprays and tasers and all that other stuff in those days. Though Perth was a little bit more genteel, I think, in those days than what it is now. But you would walk over the Horseshoe Bridge, and my first beat that day was the Murray Street Mall. Oh, it's not now the mall. In those days, Murray Street was a very busy street. And on Saturday mornings, I got engaged on the Friday, and on the Saturday morning was my first shift. And Susan and I got engaged, and my first shift was outside Bones Food Hall at 9 o'clock on a Saturday morning, directing the traffic on the crosswalk, calling people back and forth, you see. And during my time in the police school, I had an accident, and I lost 4 front teeth. I won't tell you about how it happened, but anyway, I did. And I had a denture fitted, of all things. And one of the most humiliating things that's ever happened to me in my life was that particular morning. They marched us out, and we had to appoint. You had to show what was called your appointments, and you had to present to your sergeant your handcuffs, and you had to present your baton, and you had to present your whistle, and you showed the sergeant your notebook to show that you're all up to date. So I did that. We marched over the bridge down to and I went on the crosswalk, and I was on the crosswalk, and Susan decided to bring all her girlfriends down from the GPO where she worked to see. And so I'm on the crosswalk trying to be like a policeman, and I'm stopping people, I'm blowing my whistle, and the crowd's going back and forth, and Susan's walking back and forth with all her girlfriends. She said, "There he is, that's him, that's him, that's him." And she's holding the ring up here, "That's him, that's him." And I'm saying, "Go away, will you go away? I'm trying to be a policeman." Anyway, at one stage there, Perth on a Saturday morning was bedlam, everybody, and the smell from that food hall, especially when you'd started at 6 o'clock and you hadn't had any breakfast. And I'm standing there and I'm looking up and there was a fellow in an MTT bus sitting there waiting to go, you see, and I stopped the traffic like this and I blew my whistle and my teeth shot out. And I caught my teeth, but the bus ran over my whistle. And imagine the next morning when I had to present my appointments, I had no whistle. And the mate next to me is passing the whistle back, but I've never forgotten that particular. I walked the beat in Perth for a couple of months, but my second job that I had, which was on the Sunday evening, was I was the guard on night shift at Government House, of all places. And everything seems to revolve around Government House. But they didn't give you any induction. The sergeant took you down there in the van, he dumped you outside the Government House. He said, go in and relieve the afternoon shift, and the afternoon shift came out. And he said, see you later, mate. Off he went. And I walked in, there was a little office there, a little square office where you stood, and he said, oh, you've got to go around the place. He said, make sure nobody gets in, the governor's upstairs asleep. And I thought, oh, this is good. And I thought, what am I doing? I've got nothing to eat. I didn't know where the toilets were. There's a very accommodating yew tree in the middle of Government House Gardens, I can tell you, but I didn't know where the toilets were. So anyway, I spent the night, and about halfway through the night, the sergeant arrived, and I said, oh, Sergeant, I said, I don't have anything to eat. He said, well, that's your fault. You should have brought your own. And I thought, oh, that's good. So he left me, and it must have been about 5:30 in the morning, the sun came up, and I was wandering around, and there was a bloke in a scruffy old dressing gown with a pair of scissors, and he's walking up and down, he's snipping the tops off the rosebud buds, you see. So I walked up and I said, excuse me, mate. I said, anywhere a bloke can get a cup of tea around here? And he turned around and he said, young man, you want a cup of tea, you go and get your own. He said, we don't supply that here. And he stormed off, you see. I thought, who's that? It was Sir Douglas Kendrew. And he was very grumpy with me, I can tell you, because I never got guard duty again at Government House for some reason. But I spent a couple of months in Perth walking the beat, and I did enjoy it, I must say. It was walking the beat on your own is very different, and things have changed so much now. I mean, I go into Northbridge and it really disappoints me greatly, because you see the coppers walking around in 5s and 6s, and they're armed. It's like an armed invasion squad. And my wife said to me the other day, she said, how can we feel safe here if they've got to walk around in 5s? She said, obviously they don't feel safe. And I said, no. And funny enough, I worked in London, and I'll get onto that later on. But the whole idea of being on your own and walking the beat, the sergeants would come and check on you. Every 2 hours they'd come and you had to make a point. It was called making a point. There was a certain part of your beat, you had to be on it at a set time, and the sergeant would come there at that same time to make sure you're okay. And I mean, you didn't have radios, you didn't have any of that, so there was no cameras, no CCTV. I didn't even have a whistle. So it was a very different time, I suppose, in Perth. And Perth was an interesting place, because especially on night shifts there, because you'd walk, and some of the beats went around Northbridge, and you had all the old nightclubs there. You had the Zanzibar, the El Bongo, you had the L'Aurora. I'm seeing some eyes light up here, a few of you I've noticed. And everybody used to front up with their King Brown bottles, and when you went in, they stuck a number on it, because they weren't allowed to sell grog, and they all did, mind you, I must say. But it was a very different place. And the other thing was that if you arrested anybody for shoplifting, and if I can come back to that, what I said about shame, people were more worried about getting their name in the West Australian than they were about you actually arresting them. Because it was shameful. The West used to print every day. They would print the court lists and what people were up for. And people would beg you not to get that. I said, look, it's beyond, because the West used to go down and, or the worst as we used to call it, the West used to go down and get the court sheets, and they'd print everybody's name there. And it was a very different world, I might say, in those days. I spent a couple of months in Perth, and I got transferred to Fremantle. And Fremantle in those days was a very different town to what it is now. It was a rip-roaring port. And I'd grown up in Tiger Bay in Cardiff, which is a big port, very, very different to Freo, but just as rough. And Freo was rough in those days, and there were some wonderful characters there you got to meet. Again, you walked the beat on your own. And I can tell you now that between the National Hotel, the Roundhouse, and the kiosk on the other corner of High Street, there are 2,658 paving slabs. I know, because I walked that beat for 2 years and I knew every one of them. But you know, the interesting part was, because it was such a rough town, and you didn't have the sorts of backups that you have nowadays. In fact, if you made an arrest on the street, you hailed a taxi down, you put the crook in the taxi, and you took them to the police station, and then the taxi driver would get a chit off the sergeant, which he could claim his fare back. So you didn't have all the technology and everything that you've got nowadays. And I can always remember walking down the street one day, and there were two Japanese fellows. They were smashing up a weighing machine. You remember the 1 penny weighing machines you used to have outside the shops? And it was around in South Terrace, and I walked up and I said, you know, you can't do that. And I arrested one of them, and the other one took off. And I handcuffed this one fellow to a pole, a parking pole, or wherever it was outside one of the shops there in South Terrace. And I took off after the other one. I caught him down in Atwell Arcade. As I took off, there was a fellow walking up with a Gladstone bag, one of the wharfies that I knew. And I said, mate, can you have a look after this bloke? I'll be back. I'll get the other one. I'll come back. So I came back. When I got back, he was sitting on the poor Japanese fellow's chest with his thumbs in his eyes. And he's saying, I'll get you for what you did to Bluey and Changi, you... very politically incorrect in those days. Anyway, I arrested him, took him around the station, and that was that. Freo, the one thing about Freo, though, when you walk the beat, and I learnt this in Perth very quickly, and I'm not sure if the young policemen do this nowadays, but you very quickly built a community group around you. You got to know everybody in the street. You got to know the businessmen. You always got to know the publicans. You definitely got to know those, and the restaurateurs. You got to know everybody. And if you got into trouble, it was amazing how people would come and give you assistance. They'd come and help you. You know, it was very different. And the city, the Fremantle in those days was very rough. It was. So you had more fights than cooked dinners, I've got to tell you. It was, but you learn to live with that as a young policeman. And you never back down. You never back away, because once you've done that, you've lost face, and it very quickly goes around the town. You know, he's a softie, so you never backed away. And some of the characters I can remember. I shouldn't name people, I suppose, but there was a famous football family in Fremantle in those days whose dad's first name was Toby. But and I was walking the beat in Fremantle one night, just past the National Hotel one evening actually, and there was a fellow in the back of a taxi, and he was trying to strangle the taxi driver for some reason, dressed in a suit, a very, very smart-looking chap. So I jumped in the back seat with him and I said, come on, Grandad. I said, knock it off. He was a lot older than me, and this bloke would have been in his 60s, I suppose. But he was built like a bit of whipcord. I found out later on he was a wharfie. He used to swim across the harbour every day depending on where the ship was. He didn't take the little ferry boat. He used to swim across to where the ship was. And he was as tough as nails. So I got out of the car, arrested him for disorderly, and took him around to the police station. The taxi driver was very thankful because he didn't want to die. And we took him round to the police station. I got out of the car, the taxi, and I said, come on, Grandad, out you get. And he got out and he king hit me. This is the only time I've ever been put down in the police force. And he hit me and whack, down I went. And I got up and I grabbed this fellow, and as I grabbed him, he went against the wall and he hit his face on the wall. And the sergeant came out and he said, what are you doing to that prisoner? And I said, he just knocked me out. And he said, I don't care, you can't do that to the prisoner. And then he looked at him and he said, you know who that is? I said, no. And he said, so-and-so. I said, oh. Well, what? He said, his two sons are on the other shift. They're both police officers. So, anyway, he estreated his bail. I think I charged him with drunk in the street, but that was that. One of the things I did while I was at Fremantle, I got posted to Rottnest. And I don't know if you saw that photograph in the flyer, but that photograph is actually the police station at Rottnest, which is still there, incidentally. It's still there. And we should heritage list that, by the way, Julian. It's as you go past the new police station, or the current police station, on your right-hand side is a little shack that stands on its own as you go on the road up to the basin. And that was the police station. And Susan and I had just got married, so that was basically where we spent our honeymoon, because they would send you to Rottnest about a month, 6 weeks before Christmas, and you spent then right up until about a month after Easter you spent there. And you were the only policeman on the island except for the Christmas week. They used to send a sergeant over because and Rottnest was a very political place, I can tell you, because all the pollies used to go there for their holidays and everything else. So you never knew really who you were talking to. It was a different place. And one of the things I've always remembered about Rottnest, and it's the only time I think it's ever happened, is I locked a fellow up for bigamy. There was a wedding on the island, and I was invited as the local policeman, and we went along, and it was one of the barmen. He married one of the barmaids, and it was lovely, and it was a great wedding down in the pub in those days. Rottnest was a very different place also. And anyway, about 3 weeks after I finished I got a message to ring the federal police in Perth. So I went to Des Sullivan's house. Des Sullivan was the manager of the house in those days, and the manager of the island, I should say. So I go around and see Des, and he said, "Oh, you got to ring the AFP." I rang up. They said, "There's a bloke over there just got married, so and so." I said, "Yeah." He said, "He's already married." He said, "We've got a warrant here for his arrest." So I had to go down to the pub and get him off his honeymoon and arrest him and put him on the ferry and take him. I guarantee it's probably the only time anyway, but Rotto was a great place. I thoroughly enjoyed myself there, and in fact it's become my second home. We go back every year. Whilst I was working at Fremantle, I got fascinated by the work of the detectives, and I always wanted to be a detective. I always saw myself as a detective, and they used to have a night patrol in Fremantle that drove around, and their driver was always a uniformed officer. So the uniformed officer would drive the detectives around, and I really fell in love with this idea of being a detective. So I said to the detectives at the time, I'd love to apply to be a detective. They said, "Oh, you've got to be a policeman first. You're not quite there yet. You've only been in the job a couple of months." And just after this happened, I spent 2 years at Fremantle, and then I got transferred. I got my second hat. I got transferred to Mount Barker, of all places, down south. And because it was a country posting, you got a country hat, which was very different to the ones we were wearing up then. You wore khaki. We got transferred to Mount Barker. Susan and myself went down, and we got this little wooden house. You didn't get houses in the police force in those days. You actually had to lease a house, and we got an old mill house which was on one side of the town, and we were the only police. I was the only police officer on that side of town. There were 2 other police officers and a sergeant, so there were 3 constables and 1 sergeant there in Mount Barker. We spent 2 years there actually, and whilst we were there, our son was born, Timothy. And but what I must say, and I know I acknowledged Noongar people when I first started, it was the first time I'd actually come up against, in my police career, I came up against Aboriginal people. You didn't see many of them in the city in those days, because I'm talking back 66, they still didn't have the vote. They were non-citizens, and they had to leave the city. They had to leave the central part of the city at night. After 6 o'clock, they weren't allowed in the city, except for one place in East Perth, which was called the Quitapina Wine Saloon. It was the most dreadful place. But I got to Mount Barker, and I found there was a reserve there. No, when I was in Parliament, I went to Soweto, and I spoke to people from the ANC and others there while I was there, but I'd never seen anything so bad in South Africa as what I saw when I got to Mount Barker. And it really shocked me as a young policeman. I'd grown up in Tiger Bay, and the reason they call it Tiger Bay is there's so many different nationalities and colours there, and the people, they reckon they were all striped. That's why they used to call it Tiger Bay. But it was, when I got there, growing up, and particularly growing up as the son of my father was called a refo. He was a refugee after the war. And growing up in a small Welsh town, and we actually, we went to live in a little town called Mam Island in Wales, which is halfway between Cardiff and Abergavenny. And the small Welsh towns were very bigoted. They were very narrow. It really was how green was my valley. That was what it was like. But coming back to Cardiff, I mean, I grew up with kids that were Jewish, that were West Indian, they were from Pakistan, they were Indian, and you didn't, you went to school with kids, it didn't matter. My best mate was a fellow called Sammy Ludska, and he was Jew. I was a refo, or son of a refo. We didn't realise until we were about 16 why it was every time we played Cowboys and Indians, we were always the Indians. But So I came from a background where there was very little prejudice. My father was an East European, and our house was a haven for people who were coming in from Europe after the war, displaced persons. Many of the people that lived at our house or stayed at our house still had the tattoos on where they'd been in the concentration camps. And so I didn't. When I got to Mount Barker, where there's this dreadful place called the Reserve, and there was probably 100, 120 people living there, I suppose, and some of them were very talented. There was a woman there called Bella Kelly. I know you shouldn't speak of the people that are gone, but Bella was an exceptional artist. She was one of the. There's a particular group down there, the Carolama. She was one of the artists from there, and. One of my great sadnesses is that I never got any of her art, because she used to paint in the cell down there when she was there. She was a hopeless alcoholic, and we used to lock her up fairly regularly. In those days you had a charge called vagrancy, where you could put people in for 3 months for vagrancy, and the main reason we used to do that was to dry them out, take them off the streets, put them somewhere where they could get cleaned up and get a decent feed. I got to Mount Barker, I saw this reserve, I couldn't believe it. It was a very different place, and but I started to work there, and I learnt my trade as a policeman and working with Aboriginal people down there. One thing, there's one incident that happened. Susan was about to have our son, young Tim, and he won't mind me telling this. I told her it was his 21st birthday. On this particular night, there was a riot down at the reserve. It was pension night. Everybody got drunk, and it was just bedlam. And Susan was getting ready to go into hospital. And there was a bang on the door, and that particular night, for some reason, I was the only policeman in town. The other policemen were all down at Albany or somewhere else. So there was a bang on the door, and there were 2 Aboriginal women from the reserve there, and they said, "Oh, you've got to come to the reserve. They're going to kill each other. They're all fighting." So I got in my Volkswagen. You didn't have police cars, by the way. You drove your own car. I had a little Volkswagen Beetle. They used to pay you 2 cents a mile for driving a Beetle. I drove down to the reserve, and sure enough, it was absolute bedlam down there. The lights were due to go out because they had a generator which used to go out at about 9 o'clock at night. So I just got out of the car, and I had a very politically incorrect. I had a 38 pistol, and I fired a shot into the ground, and everything went quiet. And I said, "Go to bed, or I'll shoot some of your dogs." Terribly incorrect. They all went to bed, except for 2. They kept fighting. So I walked over and I banged their heads together, and I said, "Get in the car, both of you." And I threw them in the back of the Volkswagen, took off, put them up to the police station, locked them in the cells, and I said, "Go to bed." And I thought, I better get home. So I washed the car out and a bit of phenyl in the back seat, and I raced home to Susan, and she said, "I've got to go to hospital," she said. So that stage, the next door neighbour had come in, and she was sitting in the bath. And so anyway, off we went, and I had to stop and get a packet of cigarettes on the way. And so we get there, and it was an amazing night, because the doctor came in. He was a lovely fellow. A fellow called Chris Burke was the local doctor in those days. His wife's name was Marjorie, and they had a heifer stud just outside the town, and he just delivered a calf, and he came in with his gumboots on, covered in. And he still had the heifer rope around his neck. You know, the rope they used to put around the feet and pull the heifer out of the car. And Susan just looked at him, and she was terrified. She said, and her mother's 200 miles away in Perth, and she's never... So anyway, Chris said, "Don't worry about it." He said, "Little Crim won't come tonight." He said, "You might as well go home." Because you weren't allowed in the hospital with your wives in those days. You got sent home. Anyway, the midwives took over, and must have been about 6 o'clock the next morning. There's a bang on the door, and there's Chris standing there with 2 bottles of beer. He said, "Congratulations, you got a son. We're having a beer." And I said, so up the hospital I went, and we saw this marvellous little bloke. We're still the best mates. I'm very proud of my son. Anyway, I meet this great little kid, and I said to Susan, "Fantastic." And I'd leave there, and I said, "I locked 2 people up last night." So I got out of the police station, you see, and there's these 2 blokes sitting there, and they were, "What's for breakfast?" And I said, "Hang on." So I made a pile of toast and gave them some beans, and then you had to race around and find some JPs, and because you had to convene your own court. You didn't have magistrates and those sorts of things. You had to go and find a justice of the peace. I did. I convened a court. And the 2 JPs came in, 2 of the local farmers, and I said, "Look, my wife's had a baby last night." I said, really, just give them a caution, will you?" So they get the 2 fellows up, and They read the riot act to them, and they said, no, but you're only getting a caution because the sergeant's, the constable's wife had a baby last night. He said, so you're free to go. So anyway, I let them go, and off they went. About 2 days later, virtually the entire reserve came up to the hospital and gave with presents for Susan, and they all wanted to see the baby. And leading the push was the fellow that I'd locked up, the older fellow that I'd locked up. And I thought, this is fantastic, it's wonderful. Anyway, he said, it turned out we'd named our son Timothy, and this fellow's name was Timothy. And he, to this day, he reckoned that the constable named his son after him because it was the night he arrested him. It's a lovely story. I had a great time on Mount Barker. I enjoyed myself. I worked with the local detectives, and it really just reinforced my idea that I wanted to be a detective. At that stage, I was 24 years of age, and you didn't get into the detectives until you were about 30. You had to be around for a long time. But I had a couple of lucky breaks, and we charged a couple of people down there with a massive fraud that they'd committed on the local abattoirs, and I just happened to fall across the evidence, and the big detectives came down from Perth, and they were quite pleased with what I'd done, so I got a job. And I got transferred back to Perth as a detective, and that sort of brought on my next hat, which is this one. I cherish this, I can tell you. It's my very special hat. I went to the CRB headquarters at that time. We're in that same building that's now the Art Gallery Administration. And my first day that I fronted up with a fellow called Ron Court, and we fronted up as detectives with brand new suits on. We'd been to Bones and got our suits, and we bought our hats, and we fronted up and we said, you know, we're here, what are we doing? And the sergeant in charge was a fellow called Arthur Hurlston, and Arthur said, well, go down the armoury and get yourself some guns to start with. So, guns? I didn't even know how to pull a trigger, so we got these little Webley pistols we got given, and he said, and he gave us our diaries. He said, we said, well, what's the first job, boss? You know, is it a murder, is it a homicide? He said, go up the Savoy and get the hats. And we sort of stood there and looked stunned. He said, go up the Savoy, see Pat Kenny, get the hats. I've never forgotten it. So I looked at, and we walked down, and one of the other detectives outside said, he said, Pat Kenny's the publican at the Savoy Hotel, go up and see him, get the hats. And this was on the Monday morning. And every Tuesday, they used to have a readout, they called it. Every detective in the metropolitan area used to come into headquarters, and they would be told what was going on around the city. You didn't have computers and everything to give you intelligence. You actually spoke to each other. And anyway, so Ron and I look at each other. We walk up to the Savoy Hotel, walked in and said, somebody call Pat Kenny? Oh, Pat Kenny out the back. He said, you come for the hats? We said, yeah. So we walk into Pat Kenny's office. He was the public, and he said, oh, they're over there, boys. Turned out every Friday night, all the detectives used to go to the Savoy Hotel and get on the grog. And they'd all leave their hats there. And the most junior detective on a Monday morning had to go up to the Savoy and bring all the hats back. And here's Ronnie Court and I walking down, our first grade job as detectives, walking down Barrack Street with this great big pile of Trilby hats. And then on the Tuesday morning, we had to stand at the door and hand them out to all the detectives as they came, and that was our start. Look, I spent almost the rest of my working career, my operational career as a detective. I had some of the worst cases that anybody can imagine. And the one thing I've learned very quickly in the police force, but more so when I was in the detectives, is that the role of a police officer is quite unique. I think the only other one that comes close to it would be nurses. Because the policemen and the nurses, you touch the very best of the human nature and you touch the very worst of the human nature and everything in between. There is nothing, after a couple of years as a detective, there is nothing that shocks you. There really isn't. And you really do meet some evil people, but you also meet some wonderful people, and you meet the best of both. And working through some of the cases, I suppose, and I probably shouldn't name people, but I think the only people I ever met, I suppose, in the job that I thought were truly evil were the Bernies, with the husband and wife, the Bernies. They were and are, or she still is, he's dead now, were truly evil. There was, and I worked on many, many homicides during my time. I spent most of my time as a detective on what they call the heavy squads, which was homicide, consorting, I noticed they've just brought all the consorting acts back now to deal with the bikies. In those days you had a thing called the Consorting Act, where if two crooks got together and were talking in a pub and you saw them, you could walk in and you give them what's called a consorting booking. And if they got 8 of those within 3 months, you could lock them up for 3 months. So they hated it because, you know, it was doing time for nothing, the crooks reckoned. But it was great for us because we'd say, oh, mate, you better tell us what's going on around the place, otherwise, you know, you're going to get 3 months. And it was giving my secrets away. But we did. And look, I must, and Julian said, my first, and it was with Ron Court again, my first pinch, my first arrest for a break and enter was in East Perth, and it was on Brown's Scrapyard. And you'll remember this because it was in the Royal Show for many years. We went there and we attended, and when we got there, we're doing the usual detective stuff, and we're looking around with the fingerprint bloke, and stuck in the top of the door, the gate, was a finger. The poor fellow had jumped over the gate to go and pinch some lead, and he'd caught his finger in the top of the gate and left his finger there, you see. So being the brilliant detectives we were, we went up to Royal Perth Hospital, and sure enough, there's a bloke sitting in the bed there, minus one finger. So I said to him, got to talk to you. You broke in a Brown scrapyard last night. He said, no, not me. I said, yes, you did. We got you on prints. He said, anyway, he coughed. It was him. We didn't get the lead back. He'd already sold that. But for years in the Royal Show, there was the finger was in a piece of fiberglass. They'd set it up. The fingerprint guys had actually set it up. And it used to be in the police exhibition for many years. But that was our first big pinch we had. Look, I worked on, I'm not going to go into details of some of the cases we did, but I worked a lot with kids as well, young people. My church fellowship I did was about young people. And the whole time I was in the police force, I never met a child that was born bad. I never ever met a kid that was born bad. Every kid I met was a product of their environment. And it was interesting when I talk about Aboriginal people, and I don't know if anybody saw the movie the show Brand New Day. That was an actual, we actually did that as police officers. When I was a young policeman in Perth and Fremantle, we used to lock up wards of the state. And there were kids that were brought down from the north, and they would be put a place in Riverton called Palatine Mission, or they would go into Clontarf. And these kids would do, away from their families, it was dreadful stuff, it really was. And if they tried to get back and they escaped, and we found them, we would take them to the lockup in East Perth, and you would lock them up in a cell until somebody came from the mission and took them back. Now, many of those kids now, and one of them that I knew exceptionally well, and was a young guy called Rob Riley, who went on to become a real leader in the Aboriginal community here in Perth. And it was a great tragedy when he took his own life a few years ago, and a real tragedy. But again, working with those guys, working with those kids, you had an appreciation. And I think it was, I forget which president in America said that, you know, the real causes of crime, if you think about it, are prejudice, their poverty, their injustice. They're all those things that these kids have had to grow up with over the years. And we haven't come a long way, I can tell you, particularly we're dealing with Aboriginal people. I'm very proud of the fact that nowadays that the Trust is starting to run a parallel course of history. You can't change history. You can't wipe history off, regardless of what people say. You can't pull down statues and all those sorts of things. You actually have to learn to live with history. You've got to learn and realise if you don't admit that happened, you're likely to do it again. That's the sad part about it. But working with these kids was the same. Over the years, as I said, I did many homicide cases. I started off, I was in the first initial inquiries when the Claremont serial killer happened. And one case that really sticks in my mind, and I will name him, he's dead now, was a fellow called James Alexander Tilbury. When I was a young detective, he murdered a young woman up in Serpentine. And after he murdered her, he trussed her up in such a way, it was really weird, it was strange. And myself and another sergeant, a sergeant at the time I was working with, Arthur Sims, we tracked this fellow down. We actually tracked him down to Kalgoorlie. He'd shot through after he killed this young woman. And he got picked up for stealing petrol in Kalgoorlie, and whilst he was there, the guy, he said to one of the young coppers, I think the police in Perth might be looking for me. So they rang us and we said, yeah, sure are, we want him for a murder. So we drove up to Southern Cross and brought him back in the car. And I always remember talking to this bloke, and he was particularly callous. He described what he'd done to the woman, and it was he eventually, even though he pleaded not guilty, he tried to. Nobody pleaded guilty to murder in those days because there was a death sentence. And when we convicted him, Red Burt was the Mr. Justice Burt. He put the black cap on. I don't have one of those, I'm afraid. I've got one. But he put the black cap on, and I don't know. He didn't actually put it on. The usher stood there with the cap over his head and said, "Tilbury." He read it out, the sentence to Tilbury. He said, "Tilbury," he said, "you've been convicted of wilful murder. You'll be taken from here as the sentence prescribed. You'll be hanged by the neck until dead. Stand down." And I think he was the last one ever sentenced, actually, from memory. He went to prison. It was commuted to life imprisonment. Many years later, I was running the drug squad, and one of my informants came in to see me and said, "There's a woman's been killed in a house out in Cannington." And at the time, I drove straight out there with him. He didn't want people to know he was an informant for a start. So I drove out there with him. We got to the house and he took me in, and this young woman was on a bed, and it was deja vu. I said, "I've gone backwards." And anyway, we secured the scene, and the homicide squad came out. I was on druggies at that time. The homicide squad came out, and there was a fellow who was a great mate of mine, Vincey Kadich, was in charge of the homicide squad. And Vince walked in, this was on the Friday evening, and I said, "Vince, if I didn't know different," I said, this is a bloke called James Alexander Tilbury did this. And I said, "But it can't be him because he was sentenced to death." And anyway, on the Sunday night, Vince rang me at home and said, "Bob, you were right." He said, "We just locked up James Alexander Tilbury. He'd been commuted and then he'd been paroled." And so, you know, perhaps that was one occasion where perhaps the death penalty might have been right. I mean, I'm not a believer in the death penalty anyway, but it was just one of those weird things that just stuck in your mind. So things like that. Probably the worst cases that I ever dealt with, cases against children. I did work for a while on the abuse programs with kids, and I was very fortunate in sort of moved on through life. I haven't talked much about the heritage side of Perth, but I moved on in life, I suppose, and got into administration a little bit later in life. That was after I actually did the Church of Fellowship. I was very fortunate in 1991, I did a Church of Fellowship. I travelled overseas. I was away for about half a year, and I travelled through America. America was an eye-opener, and honestly, if anybody wants to compare Australia with America, they want to go and live and work there like I did in the places I worked. My first posting was to Los Angeles, and I worked in a place called Compton, and it's like a war zone, and it was right in the middle of the crack cocaine. And I was telling a story to Julian earlier on tonight. I got there just as the fellow had been bashed on the freeway, a fellow called King, where the two fellows had bashed, and there were whilst I was there, they had the race riots in Los Angeles, the first set of race riots, and I was working with the detectives in LAPD and around the Hollywood sector, and then down into Compton. And whilst I was there, they actually sacked the chief of police. He was a fellow called Gates, because of his comments about the King bashing, because what he said was. One of his comments he made publicly, he said, "Well, all that proves is that two clubs beat a king." Not the done thing for a police commissioner to say, I can tell you. Anyway, he was sacked by the then administration. He was sacked, and he took them to the Supreme Court. They took an injunction out, and he was reinstated. And I've still got the badge at home. In America, if you're coming home from a battle or anything, they hang a yellow ribbon on the tree, tie a yellow ribbon to the old oak tree. And they had these, we all got marched into the auditorium this particular morning because Gates was coming back. And we got handed out these little badges. I've still got it at home, and it's a blue badge, a blue ribbon with a yellow stripe through it, to welcome this fellow back into the police force. I mean, it was a very different world. America hasn't changed a great deal, quite frankly, but as he marched into the auditorium, they played the triumphal march from Aida, and everybody stood up and clapped and cheered him. And it was just amazing. There was no thought for any of the other side of it. But travelling through America again, the stark difference was the way that we police. We police by consent. Oh, we did up until the last decade, I suppose, where we've tended to go back more down towards the enforcement line. In 1829, when Robert Peel set up the first police force, and it was the year that our mob got here, in 1829 he said, the police are the people and the people are the police. The police are merely the people doing things that is your inherent duty to do. And you think about that, he was dead right, because if you think about it, 96% of the community, including yourselves, unless you're driving a car, actually we police by consent. You agree not to break the law. And again, that's where that shaming was important when I was a younger man. But you agree not to break the law, as I say, unless you're driving a car. Whereas in America, it's very different. They enforce the law. It's very much an enforcement view of the world. It's very different to what we do. And thank goodness we don't do that sort of thing anymore. I'm a great believer, and I suppose, when I went into administration, they gave me another hat, a real fancy one, this one. Look at this one. It was a real fancy one, I might say. Little stripes on it. That was one of my assistant commissioner, or one of my commissioned officers' hats, which is very nice. And whilst I was working in America too, I happened to, I don't know if I've got the hat, yes I have. I worked for a while at Quantico, and they gave me this. It really stands for a very large Indian. But it's the FBI. I worked with the FBI in Quantico, and I was trained as a negotiator. In fact, in 1988-89, I negotiated the prison riot down at Fremantle, sort of a little bit more heritage, because I know what the prison at Fremantle's like. That's another story I could spend all night telling you about, I might say. I know we're running out. Finally, during my visit to England, and this is where I think policing has changed, I worked with a fellow called Sir Peter Imbert, who was the then Chief Commissioner of Police in London, and I shadowed him for a couple of days, and I always remember him saying to me, if you're going to go into police administration of any kind, he said, remember that whatever your decisions you make, he said, they must make the most junior constable's job easier. If it doesn't, you're failing. And I thought, oh, goodness. But he said, by the way, he said, have you got one of our hats? I said, no, I haven't. He said, well, come on down. We went down to the police canteen downstairs, and as we were walking out after we'd had a few beers, he said, there was one hanging on the peg. He said, here, have this one. So I said, and when I looked at it later on, I found it's from the Northamptonshire Police. So some poor fellow from Northamptonshire was obviously visiting Scotland Yard, and so he's probably a bit like me. He's got a whistle, but he hasn't got a hat. So it was a marvellous time in London. I enjoyed it. It came back, but it really, I suppose, I thoroughly enjoyed my time in the police force. I really did. I was sad when I went off the streets, because I was always a street copper or a detective. Administration was difficult. I spent about 15 years in administration under a number of commissioners. The best commissioner I ever worked with, two actually, Owen Leach and Brian Bull were the two best commissioners I worked with, but thoroughly enjoyed myself. A million other stories I could tell you, but Julian's looking at me, and I'm more than happy to chat. Thank you for listening to me.
Good on you, Bob. So we've got a minute to take a couple of questions. Does anybody have something that they're dying? We're going to have a drink and a nibble afterwards, so Bob will obviously be very happy, but he won't be behind the lectern and he won't have the floor. So if there's a question now, please let's have it. Has anyone got anything they want to ask?
I just want to know what they're going to do with my old school. You said developers.
Yeah, well, actually, it's quite. We've got a real work order on it. They're actually developing behind it, and as I understand it, for the discussions we've had with the developers, they're going to preserve as much as they can of the actual original building. They can't touch the outside, and there's only so much. And they've promised us faithfully they won't change the hall with all the plaques around it, the shields, and because if they do, my wife will kill them.
No, the fabric of the girls' school will remain as it is. It's all the land behind will be developed, and there'll be some apartment towers there. Yeah, yeah. Any others?
Oh wow.
Well, Bob, you've answered everybody's question in your Look, that was fabulous, Bob. Thank you very much. Sharing your stories, sharing your insights and your experiences in those over 3 decades in the police force, and we all enjoyed it immensely. Thank you so much.
My pleasure, Julian. Thank you. I did say it wasn't going to be too serious.
Oh, well, I think, the sort of, like social heritage is something we don't spend a lot of time talking about. We talk about buildings and landscapes and places, but to have that history that you've given us today of the police force over the last decades has been fascinating. Thank you, everybody, for coming.